Good day, everyone. It is truly wonderful to be here to welcome you at the second of our Africa Green Building webinars, our webinar series. Today, we will be exploring one of the most important topics in the field of sustainability, which is net zero and close to zero buildings, with examples from Africa, where we look at it from a global and an African perspective. Our moderator for the day will be Ms. Vere Shaba. Vere is a multi-award-winning green building consultant and a mechanical engineer who has worked for multinational engineering consulting firms for 8 years. She is passionate about high-performance green buildings that do less harm to the climate and to the environment. So she has developed specialist skills in Green Star, Edge, LEED, and Net Zero on the African continent. Vere has completed projects in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and Cote d'Ivoire. So Vere, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Mohammed. And welcome to every one of you who is a part of this webinar. We find that this is such an important topic, specifically after World Environment Day, which happened a few weeks ago, where we specifically spoke about acting on climate. A lot of the times we talk about climate and we talk about how green buildings can impact us. But the idea of today is to actually walk away from this to get a better sense of what we mean when we talk about climate action, and specifically what we mean when we talk about net zero. And so if we go to the next slide, we're speaking a bit more about World Green Building Week, which is actually going to come up a bit later. So we'll go to that in a bit later. And the whole idea of World Green Building Week, and I just want to really touch on it a little bit, is that with World Green Building Week, we really want to get people to have more action when it comes to climate and to start kind of scaling up some of the objectives that we've had. Initially, we'll just talk about green or green certifications, but what we're saying is, how do we get to net zero? And the idea is that we'll talk a bit more about net zero throughout this entire presentation, and it's very interactive. So please ask your questions. We'd love to get a sense of some of the questions that you might have for any of our panelists throughout the day. And so that's something that we'll chat a bit more about closer to the end, and also throughout the entire presentation, we'll speak a bit more about World Green Building Week, about net zero buildings, and about what that means for communities, the planet, and for economies. So if we go to the next slide, I'm very excited to introduce all of our speakers who will be speaking today. And it's a really insightful panel. And that's the reason why we say that please ask questions. If we don't get around to your questions, feel free to email africa@worldgbc.org so that we can find a way to answer the questions that you might have. But our panelists today are across basically the world and across the continent. We have Victoria, who will specifically be speaking about advancing net zero from the perspective of World Green Building Council. Then we have Georgina from the Green Building Council of South Africa, who will be chatting a bit more around net zero and actually the certification program that they have within the Green Building Council of South Africa and some of the case studies that are available within South Africa. And then we have Farizan from Tanzania, who'll be speaking a bit more about local and international case studies, because the whole idea of this is we want you to be able to see that net zero buildings is achievable and that it has been achieved on our continent. That's something that we find is so important, and we want you to be able to really get a sense of that and to catch that and to understand the concepts and the definitions and to see it in action. So that's the entire objective that we have as panelists for today. So what I will do is I'll pass over to Victoria, who will then pass over to Georgina and then to Farizan. And then at the end of all of that, we'll take some of your questions. And feel free to chat, feel free to engage amongst yourselves, and excited to go through the program. So Victoria, we'll pass over to you to chat a bit more about the definitions when it comes to net zero.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this webinar today. I'm really pleased to be able to share with you some of the experiences that we've had through the Advancing Net Zero program, and to share with you some case studies from around the world. The reason that we are talking about buildings is that they are a critical solution to climate change. Buildings are responsible for 39% of global carbon emissions, and as climate events are increasing in severity and frequency with devastating impacts on our planet, it is important that we drastically cut the carbon emissions that our sector is responsible for and curb our effect on climate change. The green building sector has been live for several years now, but we really started with rapid urbanization sort of leading up to 2015, sort of in the past 5 years. We have been embracing a green building movement since the early 2000s, where the realities and the recognition of the benefits of green buildings that they bring to people, to planet, and also to profit, because they often cost less to operate. And that movement, that shift towards green buildings really took on speed leading up to about 2017 globally. But the reality is that in order to achieve our climate reduction targets, we must reach net zero carbon buildings by 2050. And the huge gap that incurs between the definitions of green buildings that are a little bit better for us than typical buildings that might meet code, to the very high performance buildings that we are talking about as net zero carbon buildings, is very large. And so it's important that we understand how this can be achieved, and that we can leap over that gap from ordinary buildings into net zero carbon buildings. And looking ahead, we need to be thinking about creating regenerative and resilient cities and healthy communities that support a responsible and healthy way of life and well-being. So the Advancing Net Zero project was created by the World Green Building Council as a global campaign to accelerate the uptake of net zero carbon buildings to 100% by 2050. And we want to do that by increasing awareness and education of the urgency and achievability of net zero carbon buildings, to achieve alignment and commonality between the different approaches and certification schemes that green building councils have all around the world. And then finally, to expedite uptake in global markets by sharing market leadership examples through events and forums such as the one we're having here today. We at World Green Building Council have set a whole life carbon vision that says by 2050, buildings need to be addressing both net zero operational carbon and also the embodied carbon associated with the materials and construction that go into their building and renovation over the future. And that by 2050, both of those impacts need to be zero. And through this vision, we've created a framework to help us get there that sets a definition and guiding principles for both net zero operational carbon and achieving net zero embodied carbon. And we have some interim targets for 2030 to help us get there, to help us accelerate that transition. But the main thing that we need to be communicating is that when we talk about net zero carbon buildings, we first of all mean the way they operate, the way they perform. And that means they need to be highly energy efficient, with all of their energy demand met by 100% renewable energy. And as we transition into a whole life perspective, those buildings also need to be very considerate of where the materials are coming from that's being used to build them, and the carbon impacts of those materials from their production and then all the way through the building's life cycle. So to run through some definitions on what we mean by net zero, first of all, we take the baseline of the building. So the energy consumption that is expected to be used by the building, and therefore how many carbon emissions it will be responsible for during its operation based on how that energy is generated. Through energy efficiency measures, we can reduce the energy demand, and that building will be more energy efficient than if it was built to local code requirements, let's say, if you brought in measures like improved glazing, or you maximize the use of natural ventilation and lighting to reduce the power needs of the building. So that might mean that the building is energy efficient, but in order to bring it into the sort of net zero and net carbon categories, it then needs to meet its energy demand with renewable energy. And if you're able to produce some renewable energy on site to meet nearly all of that reduced demand, then that building could be nearly net zero energy or net zero ready. So it's prepared for a grid that is in future decarbonized. Where a building has met all of its needs with renewable energy on site, that's called net zero energy. And where it generates more energy that it needs to operate, and therefore shares that energy back to the grid, or even with buildings around it, that's an energy positive building. But for us, we feel that in order to achieve our net zero targets, we need to be focusing on net zero carbon, because not every building will be able to meet its energy demand on site with solar panels on its building. So it's important for us to consider where renewable energy can be generated off-site and then bought and brought into the building, so outside of the building's boundary itself. And where that's not possible, we also recognize the role of carbon offsets in order to balance the carbon necessary to operate that building. And so that's what we mean by net zero carbon buildings. Our green building councils in our network around the world have been busy creating tools and resources and programs to help promote how to achieve net zero within their particular markets. And there's lots of different names and terminologies based on how a market is responding to the challenges of net zero, and whether they might be including other impact areas within that program, whether they might have different restrictions on the way that you can procure renewable energy, for example, but very much based on the local context and what is appropriate. They may all be called different things, but they all follow the framework that I set out earlier with those key principles. And so it means that there is alignment within what they mean by net zero. And in this case, zero really does mean zero. In terms of the value proposition for net zero carbon buildings, whether you are a policymaker, an investor, an owner-occupier, a developer, or a tenant, there will be a compelling reason for you to take on and embrace net zero buildings as part of your portfolio. Whether that's sending positive signals to the market or back to policymakers about the readiness to embrace net zero buildings, whether you're ensuring that your assets are fit for the future and they are Paris proof, so they are prepared and future proofed against future impacts of climate change, and whether it means that you're creating enhanced internal environments for your occupants, or whether it's ensuring that you're taking opportunities through your core business activities to demonstrate climate leadership. No matter where you are across that value chain, no matter what type of stakeholder you are, there will be a net zero journey for you. And so I encourage you to find what that means for your organization. So a few case studies from around the world, firstly starting with within the Middle East, North Africa region. This is Fanan Eco Lodge, which is in Jordan. It is a small boutique hotel located very remote location in the desert that actually has on-site solar panels to generate enough energy needed for its electricity and also its hot water. And they really critically analyze which rooms and which spaces need to have artificial light at night so that they can really keep their energy demand down. And so that's limited to spaces like the kitchen and office areas, and everywhere else is lit up with candlelight actually during the night to really bring that energy demand down, and really helps us consider where we need to be using energy within our buildings. The second case study I want to share is from the University of Singapore. This is a very large building that has achieved net zero in use. It's the School of Design and Environment at the National University, and it's really optimized natural and passive ventilation and daylighting through the orientation of the building, drastically reducing its energy consumption and then generating all of its energy needs on site. The third case study I'd like to share is the Weed Army Community Hospital at Fort Irwin in California. This is 40 miles from the nearest town, so it was very important for it to be self-sufficient. And as you can see from all of the solar panels underneath there, there's a huge solar farm there that is designed to generate enough electricity capacity to power a hospital, which is an incredibly energy-intensive facility, through things like energy efficiency measures again, and using passive design and very efficient active systems to bring the energy demand down and then meet the remaining energy requirements using those solar panels. And then a final example is from the residential sector and actually affordable housing. And this is to consider how the social benefits of net zero buildings in the low running and operating costs of these buildings. In this case, the energy consumption of the homes was brought down by 40% purely by addressing energy efficiency measures such as better glazing, better insulation, and again, using prevailing wind direction for natural ventilation. And then the energy demand is met through on-site solar for energy, for electricity and for hot water as well. So I would just finish there by sharing some global trends that we're seeing from around the world in terms of embracing and advancing net zero, and some concepts and philosophies that can be applied to achieve net zero really anywhere in the world, in any context, any geography, with any budget, and also in any type of building. So first of all, I would say energy and carbon budgeting. Using energy and carbon as a decision maker, as a deciding factor, not just the cost of a project, but how much carbon will this project use and will it meet our carbon and energy budget requirements. Secondly, looking at the tools and resources that are becoming increasingly available to help support the development of some of these buildings through the use of forecasting and being able to use benchmarking and more data. And I think we're going to hear from some other speakers about that as well. Collaboration and integration. These high performance buildings, it's essential for the design team to work together, for the architects, the engineers, everyone to understand the impacts of their decisions and their design ideas on the performance of the building. Net zero, in all of the case studies that I've just outlined, they've all achieved net zero, but all in their own individual ways. And there is unfortunately no one single solution that will equal net zero. But providing you're taking a strong approach to energy efficiency, procuring or generating renewable energy where you can, and having a building that is ready for a net zero future, then it means that net zero can take many forms, but still have all of the benefits that we've outlined. And then finally, I encourage you to commit to action, to find out what net zero means for you, for your organization, for your projects, and really embrace it as the way that we as an industry need to be building, designing, and operating our buildings. Thank you very much. So I think we'll now pass over to Georgina Smit from the Green Building Council of South Africa. Hi there, Georgina.
Thank you, Victoria. Hi, everyone. It's Georgina from the GBCSA. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join on today's webinar series. I'm just checking that my mouse is working. And I don't seem to be getting any movement. Let me just minimize this. I think you guys just need to hand over control. I still don't seem to have it. Sorry guys, just hang on with us for a bit. Well, I'll just start talking you through some of the things that I was going to discuss. I thought I'd take you through the GBCSA's journey through net zero in South Africa to date. We've got some interesting case studies. Guys, I'm still not, hello?
Georgina, we may have to do verbal navigation. So if you could go to the next slide, Rand, if you could please go to the next slide.
Yes, Georgina, you have mouse control, but if it's not working for you, I can switch the slides for you, no problem.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's move on to the next slide, thanks. As Victoria pointed out, the GBCSA is obviously part of the World Green Building Council Advancing Net Zero program. And in response to this, we've developed certification schemes that deal with net zero. We've launched and developed training products, and we've got advocacy strategies. Today, I'm going to talk you primarily through our certification schemes and also touch on our some of our advocacy work. And if you want any more information on our training programs, please get hold of me and I can send the details through. Thanks. Next slide. So we've certified over 540 buildings actually to date. This was our 500 kind of milestone that we reached at last year's convention, demonstrating the tangible impact that green buildings have on either energy or water savings. Thanks. Next slide. Our certifications are informed by a whole range of different tools, primarily looking at either new build, when you're looking at the intention and the design of a building, and also looking at existing buildings. But obviously, what's really exciting and what has really captivated the market of late is net zero. And the GBCSA, as we mentioned, we came up with our own certification tool, but I'm also going to touch on EDGE, which we use to certify residential developments in South Africa. EDGE has been developed by the IFC, which also now, since 2020, has a zero carbon option. Thanks. Next slide. So, our net zero scheme. I thought I'd share some of the interesting things that potentially makes it slightly different. We can apply it to carbon, and we've actually extended it also to water, waste, and ecology. I think we're one of the only GBCs that has extended it all the way to ecology. And we also look at both a modeled or a measured option, and this is quite interesting. A lot of net zero schemes only look at measured options for existing buildings, so that's when you would focus on consumption data, for example, over 12 months. We felt that it was important because of our market and our context to offer options to projects along every stage within a building's life cycle to consider net zero ideas. We wouldn't want buildings to get to the stage where they are existing and then they retrospectively need to retrofit because net zero design principles were not thought of at the design stage. You can pursue net zero on its own, if for example, if your project wants to go off the grid, or if you are pursuing it in parallel with another certification. I think what's interesting to note, and this is true for quite a lot of net zero certifications, is that it's only valid for 3 years. And the thinking behind this really is to try and incentivize continuous improvement. The whole goal for net zero is that we get existing buildings net zero by 2050, because we're talking about tangible, real impacts in terms of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. So once a project, gets their design right, we would hope and encourage them to then also look at net zero during the operational phase of the building, and not just to stop at design. In terms, and I'm just going to focus on net zero carbon for, for today's presentation. Our definitions have been, informed by the World Green Building Council's definition. The GBCSA was, very involved at the time with some of those initial kind of conversations where there were loads of definitions that and considered. Next slide, please. But obviously, what came out key is that efficiency is one of the first principles. And in order to achieve a net zero carbon certification by the GBCSA, you have to demonstrate that your project has achieved efficiency. Then secondly, you can look at on-site renewables. The third option would be looking at off-site renewables. And then, as Victoria says, also looking at offsets as an option, and that needs to be realistic, because when one considers high-rise buildings in the middle of town, we need to understand what the technical challenges are for those buildings and basically the technical limitations in order for them to pursue net zero. Thanks, guys. Next slide. I think you've got to skip. Okay, and the next slide, please. Okay, great. And another interesting thing about our net zero carbon and all of our net zero ratings is that we introduced different levels, and this recognizes the different stages within a product's carbon life cycle. So the first stage, level 1, if you don't just mind pressing a few times because it's going to come up in different little stages, you could just press all of them. Yeah. Level 1 looks at the base building. So this really just looks at non-tenant kind of energy uses, so all the fixed services within the buildings. Level 2 then looks at your base building plus occupant operations. So this, then would include the operational energy used by the building occupants, and you would include things like electrical appliances, tenant lighting, the plug loads, and, for example, process energy. Currently, we are only able to certify at level 1 and level 2, because if you look at levels 3, 4, and 5, our current market conditions in South Africa at the moment are just that we don't have enough available data at scale in order to warrant level 4 and 5, level 3, 4, and 5. So just to keep that in mind, we are open to whichever point emerges where we are able to certify levels 3, 4, and 5, we will then so do. Thank you. Next slide, please. Here is an example of a project that has been certified to Dam Sustainable. I've got a picture of the project coming up. But what's interesting to share is these certificates are very transparent and kind of reveal how the project went about achieving net zero. You can see that the level is depicted at the bottom, and we also are transparent about disclosing the proportion of offsets that have been purchased as part of the strategy, and then basically explaining when the validity of the certificate expires. Thanks. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I thought that I could showcase some of our certifications to date. Vere mentioned in the beginning that we want examples of net zero, and yes, we do have certified examples within South Africa and therefore on the African continent. We've got 16 net zero and net positive certifications through the GBCSA. 8 of those relate to carbon, so half of that, and out of those 8 we've got 7, the majority obviously being net zero, and we also have 1 net positive rating. Our definition of net positive in the GBCSA is that you've got to obviously produce, your supply's got to be 5% in excess of your demand. And we also have net positive ratings for waste and ecology. You can see the grey within the bar graph over there. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then digging a bit more down, we've got a nice balance between level 1 and level 2, but the majority of our net zero carbon certifications are modeled as opposed to measured, and this speaks to our prediction that we needed to have the modeled option for our market because it would be considered useful and an appropriate tool for where our market is at in dealing with net zero. Thanks. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've got some examples here. We've got 78 Corlett Drive, which is an office block in Johannesburg. All of our net zero case studies are on our website, and I've kept the link in here so that when we share it later, you can also go and read the case studies to get a bit more detail, understand which teams were involved in these projects. But 78 Corlett Drive was a level 1 net zero carbon, and it also got a 6-star Green Star rating. And the key thing, or their path to net zero, was they really used passive good building design as their starting point. They made sure that they looked at each orientation and made sure that it had the appropriate bioclimatic response to either the north or the south or the east and the west. Next slide, please. After achieving that kind of good passive design, within the envelope. They then looked at efficiencies within their active systems, such as their lighting and their HVAC. And then lastly, there is a PV installation on the roof, which helps the project achieve net zero. Next slide, please. Here we've got an example of a industrial building. So this is Greenfield Industrial Park. And, industrial buildings have got great potential for net zero, obviously because of their large roof space, which can be fitted out with PV. And when you compare that to the kind of minimal energy demand that most kind of lightweight industrial requires, it's an easy win for industrial buildings to go for net zero. And what we ideally want to be doing is making sure that all of our industrial buildings are kitted out with PV on the roof, so that the excess could actually then be exported to buildings or to the grid, that don't have the appropriate space to generate enough electricity. Next slide, please. And here we've got 2 Dams Sustainable, which is a sustainable trout farm. It's totally off the grid, primarily through PV and also through a bit of microhydro. And then just in terms of the carbon emissions associated with the gas for cooking, offsets were used to achieve carbon neutrality. So we have other examples of offices. We also have some residential examples. There are other industrial projects that have also qualified. So please go and have a look at our website so that you can see the kind of diversity of projects that have achieved net zero. Obviously, we are really trying to move to the point where we look at much taller buildings, but due to the technical limitations and the issues associated with green procurement in South Africa, that's still going to be that happens. Next slide, please. So just a quick note on EDGE. EDGE, as I've said, obviously looks at our residential developments within South Africa. And once you have achieved EDGE Advanced, which demonstrates that your energy savings are in excess of 40%, you can then pursue a zero carbon rating. The difference between EDGE and the GBCSA's net zero carbon rating is that this is only operationally focused. So it would be like our measured option, looking at operational consumption data, and similarly it needs to be renewed on a regular basis, because obviously we're talking about ongoing and continuous development. Thank you. Next picture. I thought it would be useful to touch on some of our key kind of drivers for net zero in South Africa, just to share some of the kind of broader policy enablers that are supporting this movement. We obviously have some supply issues from our main utility, and so there you get a very voluntary kind of market response to wanting to go green or to be net zero, so that you can ensure the continuity of your business operations. But we do have other drivers. Next slide, please. The first one this year that was really interesting and hopeful was our national building regulations, are called SANS 10400 XA. They were first released in 2011, and they stipulate legislation that governs how energy efficient buildings need to be. In 2020, after a lot of waiting from industry, the update was released for public comment, and it's far more user friendly, and it has greatly improved or kind of drastically reduced targets, which will drive energy efficiency in the right way. So that's been a kind of great step for the industry going forward, and that's really highlighting the role of kind of legislation in being a driver for this movement. We thought it would be interesting when the update came out to kind of crunch our certification data, to look at the numbers, to understand where Green Star buildings from our office data set sits in comparison to some of the targets. And you can just click on a bit, and we can I'll just talk through this graph. And so there's quite a lot of data, and I'm just obviously due to time, I won't be able to go through all of it, but what it kind of proved is that the majority of the Green Star buildings are, within the target, so the averages are, within the targets, but there are, if you look at the range of the kind of green plot graphs, just click again, sorry, you can see that the red lines represent the legislation. Those are the limits that you've got to fall within. So there's a vast majority of projects that are well within the limits, but there are projects at a 4-star baseline that would need some form of market transformation to meet some of the limits depending on their location. So I think that was also interesting. And then the last kind of driver or enabler that I just want to share, which I think is interesting from a South African perspective, next slide please, is all of our 4 major cities, so we're talking about Johannesburg, Cape Town, Tshwane, eThekwini, are all part of the C40's South African Buildings Program, which is obviously aligned with the World Green Building Council's goal of achieving net zero by 2030 for all new builds. And all the cities are really committed to ensuring that some type of regulation actually legislates the need to have net zero buildings by 2030, which would be, incredible for South Africa if they manage to get it right. And they're in different processes. They've kind of drafted their policies, and they're all in different processes of either, getting stakeholder buy-in or getting council approval for stakeholder support. So just to share, contextually with you, I thought it would be interesting to the listeners today. I think that's onto my last slide then, please. So thank you. Just a reminder that we've got our convention, which due to obviously COVID-19 has been moved virtually, but it's still happening. And we would love for you guys to join us. There'll be a lot more stories also on kind of net zero buildings. What are the successes? But more importantly, I think sometimes it's also about talking about the challenges and kind of sharing those with the broader community. Thank you, and I look forward to questions. I'm going to hand over to Farizan now.
Okay, thank you, Georgina. Farizan will now just present on other additional local and international case studies.
So for this particular case study, I'm going to have 2 examples. Both are actually from Kigali. It's going to be related down to housing, affordable housing. And the other one is actually a SOHO. SOHO is a small office and home office. In these 2 examples, I will also relate on how we get there in terms of the pathways and in terms of how we use to offset. Both examples do not require any purchase offsets, whether it's REC, REC, or whether it's carbon offset. So it's actually built and offset from the site. Okay, so the DC house and communities is one. So this particular place is actually part of a bigger master plan, which consists about 14 hectares. But the one that we targeted was actually this particular zone here, which is called a DC Eco Maison. community is about 3.4 hectares. It has about 300 units of houses. So literally it has, for the 3 bedrooms, we have 80 meters square built up area and 72 meters square land area here itself. So this is not social housing, it's affordable housing. This house will be actually part of the Africa Development Bank Fund houses. So how we actually do it is like all the approaches of before, we look into the design. But this design, the way we look at it is a little bit more different because it's under affordable. So it's what we call townhouses. So the built area is actually just this much. However, we built it up so we have a better amount of usable space to go through. As you can see from this segment, we actually use a lot of airflow ventilation passively running through the design. The reason why we did this is partly is because to cater against any flood resilience structure and also use the space as a car park. So it's sheltered when you actually take off or actually comes on or comes off. And we do have this balcony and we do have a roof terrace as well where we put in the solar panels towards the end. So this particular design is actually a row houses, or some of you call it townhouses. The ventilation cooling of the stemmal mass is actually taken care from the materials that we actually used and all the equipments, which I will show later in my slide. So we take a look at 2 things. Dominantly, we took a look at the climate responsive design. So for the concrete, we use foamcrete. Foamcrete has a very good U value. Besides taking care of the orientation, which we take it for granted that it's already been designed in. So we skip that part. And so we go straight into the thermal mass design. Of course, the fenestration, being affordable housing, we do not have a lot of glass and windows. So we limit it to the bedrooms as well as the living rooms. We do have this ventilation below where air flows, so it actually rather soothing for you actually to be on the top here. We also look into those roof space, and since we are in part of KSAP, $1 million roof challenge in Rwanda, we have developed our own paint system with very high SLI and thermal emissivity coating that assists a lot in the insulation of the roof, which is one of the hottest areas. And we offset it with the PV panel. We also bring in biophilia design for the sky garden as well as terraces to cool down the surfaces. So this is going into a little bit of the details. So as I mentioned, we take it that it's already design facing northeast and southwest. That's logical. However, the foamcrete has a very good U value of 1.5 watts per meter square because it doesn't use any concrete aggregates. And the tinted glass we use for SC value of 0.5. And also for the roof, we use the same material, foamcrete, along with the thermal emissivity of 0.9 as well as LI of 79. We also use the radiation to counter the radiation along the perimeters and outside. We use SLI of 79 in terms of material system and finishes. What we did extra was actually to go into the active system, which is one of the hardest. This particular building, we only go, why it's called a DC house is because we only plug in onto DC. So there is no transmission loss from AC to DC. So we look at all the LED lights and the ceiling fans. So ceiling fans is actually incorporated together with the lights and it's powered by the DC, which is actually the solar panel on the top. We also use eco fridges, which is what we call DC fridges and TV, to lower down the load that is coming into the houses. Thermal comfort is one of our biggest driving force, because most of those people who actually live in this house, they have to be comfortable with everything shut also, which means that if you have your fenestration shut, if you have your doors shut and nothing is, everything is shut, will you actually reach the thermal comfort that you actually wanted? So we have the ceiling fan, and of course we have to do verification study to make sure that the thermal comfort is not compromised in the path of going for zero. So that is actually very important. And as I mentioned, the fan is actually powered by DC fan together with the light. That actually helps a lot in getting the PMV value or of the thermal comfort value to at least slightly cool or not cool. So this is actually how the pathways we have to do. We have to compute all the energy, all the hours, and gets out the total consumption. The DC to AC equipment, we have about 25% in terms of load, lower in load from losses, from inversion loss. That helps a lot in humidity and high temperature also, because all those inversion loss actually emits heat within the space. Inversion loss can also be part of the battery system, anything that has a battery pack system, maybe a computer or any electronic. So we fully advocate to actually use a DC devices for these houses. So it's pretty simple. It's actually demand versus the panel that you actually offset. So we are close, 1533 kilowatt hour per year. Again, for us, we only use measured. We do not buy certificates, neither do we model. So we use prescriptive methods because it's a house, it's kind of simple and to actually know, and any offset or any verification will need to be done once upon operation. So for this, we use bifacial. Bifacial is about 410 watt peak, and we need only like 2 bifacial panels, and it costs about $2,000 versus the current electricity rate. So it's quite easy for everyone to follow that. It takes about less than 3 years to pay off your bills, and the rest is actually free energy coming in. The next one, that's quite easy. The next one is La Maison Vere. So this is a zero energy building, but it's actually based on residential, but it's what we call SOHO. SOHO is a concept of small office and home office. So living space as well as working space is essentially in the same space with high measurement. So you have a split case within the building. As you can see for yourself, we covered literally the whole top space in solar panels. We use the same method as what I have mentioned just now. However, this is a bit more harder because it's a high rise, and I think this building is you can relate to because there's kind of like a lot of buildings which looks similar like this. So again, we use the same computation as what we did. We take for account that all the envelopes has already been the best of the envelopes, as well as the thermal emissivity, the roof as well. And we compute out the energy for the 2 bedrooms, the 1 bedroom, as well as the 3 bedrooms. And we get the total amount of consumption. And out of that total amount of consumption, we actually use it to offset with the PV panels. So again, our case is always measured. So we cannot look into a building until it's actually measured through bills and in operation of minimum 6 months before we can define it as a zero energy. Once again, we do not buy any REC or carbon offset credits in this project. So those are the 2 projects I would like to share. So I'd like to give you some tips on a summary of how to actually try for yourself zero energy. So in summary, is this, it's just a simple ABC of zero energy metrics. I guess anyone will not get lost. As what Victoria said, there's no exactly wrong or right way to start in this dynamic path to zero. Then again, you start with the design, you have the shell, and it takes care of everything in the envelope. As an architect and engineers all come together. And the energy will come in. So energy, we have not just optimization, we have hybrid coolings as well. And we have plug loads. Why there's a little blue star there for energy and plug loads? These are the hardest to actually compute out because it all depends on the occupation and the operation of the building. So these 2 segments, energy and plug loads, may require some level of innovation. It depends on the scale of the building. If the scale of the building is higher, I think the level of innovation will need to go higher as well. After you've done this 4 boxes, then you go into the controls to actually put in control system and monitoring system so that you're well aware where you are in terms of consumption and versus offset. There's 2 other ways that you can actually do. You can do, on-site PV panel, of course, and if you have neighboring buildings with space, you can do off-site and therefore you become zero carbon. Or if you can do it on-site, then become zero energy. And of course, if you're in a space where there's an SEZAC or in the infrastructure is modeled in a way, then you could just easily decarbonize the whole grid, and you would actually have a zero community with it. So that's about it, I think. Okay, so coming to this is the lowering demand part. You have to really take care of the transmission loss, the receptacle load. These are what we call the ghost loads, which goes in operating load and the building design in terms of lowering the demand. So simply put, to lower the demand to offset with renewable energy is to lower the whole demand and to bring in on and off site to achieve zero. So if you can't do it, do that, at least you come close to super low energy or near zero, and you can do positive energy, simply produce more than you demand. There is a website, a global website here that is called Geo Map, and that will be able to show you also the global amount of net zero building in the world. It's administered by IEA. Yes, I think that's my end of presentation there.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you, Farizan. Thank you. So we see that we have 8 minutes, so I'd love if all the panelists could just come back on the video. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Georgina. Thank you, Farizan. We only have 8 minutes and we've received so many questions. Just to answer a few, and then I have no choice but to first of all encourage you to go to the MENA Congress next week so that we can delve deeper into some of these content, and also just to really be in contact with your local Green Building Council. But before I get to that, just some of the questions we had was about membership. If you want to be a member of the council within your country, please email africa@worldgbc.org. Because in your country, you have green building councils who are running with this. There were quite a few questions for the GBCSA. So if you can email that, we'll be able to link you up with your local council who'll be able to talk you through some of the certification programs or some of the thoughts and concepts and notes and thought leadership and case studies that they have in their country. There are also questions about costs. In the next 3 weeks, so on the 9th of July, we'll have another webinar series that will specifically look at green financing. So we will send an email out with the link to that. And so because we honestly have just a few minutes, I'll just ask the one question to you, Victoria. So one of the questions was the challenges of net zero that you've observed locally and globally. What would you say the greatest challenge has been? I love how Georgina kind of scaled it down to a net zero program that's available in the country. And Farizan just said, this is how simple it is. It's these 4 blocks. What would you say the challenges have been to implementing and advancing net zero? And how can the people who are on this call be able to address that? How can they implement net zero at the end of this call? How did they overcome that?
Sure, thanks very much, Vere. I think the challenges can be placed into a few buckets. We have sort of the perceptual challenges, the technical challenges, and the financial challenges. And those are really sort of the 3 things that seem to be the barriers towards uptake of net zero buildings. But as we've heard through this session, they're possible, they're absolutely achievable. It's just about really breaking down those concepts and understanding how they can be applied in those markets. What we know, because of how many net zero buildings there are out there, is that the technological barriers are being overcome. And actually, in some cases, there is no cost premium in taking a net zero approach to buildings. So actually, it comes down to the perceptual, right? Creating the demand and making sure that people are asking for net zero buildings. People are challenging clients and architects and designers to come up with net zero solutions. The key to achieving mainstream net zero buildings is regulation. But before we achieve regulation, before policymakers decide to implement regulation for net zero buildings, we as an industry have to prove that it can be done, and that means we need more examples, more case studies at scale. You know, that we've saw some great ones on this presentation. So really it's about creating that demand and helping us overcome the perceptual barriers that net zero is difficult or expensive, because it's simply not the case.
Okay, thank you. And I guess just leading on to that, because we have a few more minutes, I can squeeze this one in. Georgina, from your side, some of the challenges that we face from an Africa side within those 3 frameworks that Victoria was speaking on, are they, how have some of the clients overcome those challenges? And then we'll move to Farizan as well for you. How have some of those clients overcome those challenges?
Yes, no, thanks, Vere. That you know, Victoria's touched on those different themes. I think that particularly within a South African and potentially also an African context, I think the role of legislation and regulation is really important. About, you know, what is that minimum requirement that buildings need to reach, and how is that driving the minimum standard for energy efficiency to drive net zero going forward. So it's not only, you know, it's both the regulation or the regulatory part of it, but it's also the implementation and the enforcement of that legislation. I mean, we know in South Africa that even with the, you know, kind of, you know, SANS standards coming out, that sometimes, you know, they're not complied with. So, you know, we've got those kind of issues in terms of, yes, we might even have legislation now, but do we know it's actually going to get implemented at scale? So I think that that's a really important element. Then I think it's also about, you know, really setting ambitious goals. And you might have, you know, kind of competing priorities. But I think that if people understand, you know, that net zero is part of an environmental goal that is about, you know, climate change mitigation, which ultimately has got health impacts, you know, and survival impacts for everybody. So it's also about framing it differently, and I suppose that maybe it probably speaks to perception that Victoria mentioned, but I think that that's really important. And then, you know, the things about inspiration and stories that inspire. You know, we've got so many great examples of innovation in Africa. You know, I know from working on project teams, you know yourself. I think it's really about celebrating and showcasing those examples. I mean, you know, we've got 8 already, you know, that we can showcase. We've got another 8 already, and most of them are carbon that are in the pipeline, and they're also growing at scale. So it's about showcasing talent and the kind of technical skill that we have on the African continent.
Okay, and I think Farizan, that's probably quite similar then in terms of the context within East Africa, or just Africa in general, the projects you've worked on. How have some of your clients overcome these challenges? Because that's a lot of the questions that have come in. There were some technical ones, and I'd love to say technical questions, africa@worldgbc.org, and then we'll be able to direct you. But the clients, convincing the clients.
Okay, so it's actually how I did it. I think generally is what drives me to it is to convince them it's possible. That's all I did. And to convince them it's possible is to show the numbers to them. It's not just, I'm not going to say it's very easy. I'm not going to say that, but it's hard. And I've done not just a house, but so the numbers make sense. The numbers have to make sense, not just modeled numbers, because we have to live through the process. At the end of the day, we are there still standing to tell them, look, we did it. It's Z0. So we have to do that. I mean, that's the only way to motivate people to replicate again and again and again. That's the only way. If we do one and it manages to show it, and you can persevere through it, there will be more. That's how I did it.
Okay, I think that's a good way to end. So I think the whole heart of what we're trying to say with net zero and what we've tried to do across this entire webinar is to say these are the definitions. It's happening globally across the world, and it's also happening within our own continent. Georgina has gone through examples, Farizan has gone through examples, and what was nice is that they almost had different approaches. One was through certification and modeling and going through the numbers, and the other one was really just through doing a design and integrating net zero concept within the design to show that it can be done across the African continent, which is so important to talk about and so important to see. And this is only the beginning of the webinar series that we have. So for a lot of the technical questions that we got, please do email the email address that I had spoken about. And for even more information, we're going to delve deeper into this with the MENA Congress that is happening next week. And for the MENA Congress, that's with Middle East and North Africa, you can email the MENA, so MENA, at worldgbc.org if you want to know more about that. And throughout the entire rest of the year, we have a lot more that we'll be doing to delve deeper into this from a technical perspective. So coming up, we do have the Africa Green Building Summit. We do have the Green Building Council South Africa's annual convention. We do have other webinar series as well that are happening throughout the year. And then lastly, we do have the World Green Building Week, where we're asking for government, we're asking for policymakers, and we're asking for building makers to act on climate, not just talk about it, but act on it, set more ambitious goals. And not only that, let's showcase and celebrate those who have done it before. So thank you for joining us for this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar that will happen in 3 weeks' time, 9th of July. We will be speaking about green financing, and we'll definitely be going into more detail with net zero across the different series. So please do check your emails. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Vere. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.